He slammed the battered door of the cabin against the wind, his lungs burning like a furnace in a coal mine. Behind him, sirens howled like wolves, rattling the very trees that guarded this forgotten hollow. The forest pressed in on all sides, black bark, tangled roots, and a darkness so thick it seemed to swallow sound. James's heartbeat thumped against his ribs as if each beat could summon the police. Inside, the cabin was a mausoleum of decay. Sagging beams groaned under their own weight, broken windows stared like hollow eyes at the night. Every step he took echoed in the silence, a warning that the walls themselves might betray him. He pressed his palm against the rough wood, feeling for a seam, a crack where he could pry something loose. The cabin offered no obvious exits, only a single crumbling door and a jagged, broken window on the north wall. James's eyes flicked over the scene, noting that any escape would mean forcing himself through rotting boards or wedging his way out of a shattered pane. He had to act before the police could close in. He shoved the door with all his strength. It splintered, sending shards like teeth across the floor. A burst of cold air rushed past him, carrying the scent of damp earth and rot. James lunged forward, grabbing at the broken window frame as if it were a lifeline. He twisted, he wrenched, his fingers bruised by splinters, and finally forced the pane to buckle, sending shards flying like confetti. The wind howled through the broken glass, whipping around him. The police could hear the clatter from outside. They would know something had happened here. James slipped inside, heart hammering in his chest, and pressed himself against a wall of splintered boards. He was breathing hard, every breath a sharp inhale that tasted like iron. The sirens grew louder, closer, a relentless drumbeat that threatened to crush him into the floorboards. The cabin seemed to close in on him. The shadows deepened, swallowing any light that dared enter. He could feel the police closing in, each footstep a promise of capture. James looked around for a way out, a hidden passage, a loose board, a broken door. But the cabin was a maze of decay. His fingers brushed against the rough wood of the broken window frame, feeling for a crack he could widen with his palm. He saw it, just a hair's breadth from a splintered plank. With a grunt, he pulled his wrist and twisted, forcing the board to shift. The window opened wider, just enough for him to squeeze through. He darted out into the night, the wind slashing at his face as if trying to push him back. He ran without looking back, the sirens trailing like a distant storm. But the cabin was behind him, its decaying walls whispering threats that would not let him rest. The forest swallowed his footsteps. The trees stood as silent sentries, watching every movement. He burst into the cabin again, this time with the urgency of someone who had just slipped through a narrow opening in a collapsing building. His lungs burned, but he was determined to find an escape route that would not expose him to the police. He scanned the interior, broken beams, rotten floorboards, and the faint glow of moonlight filtering through cracked windows. The cabin offered no obvious exits now. Every door seemed to lead back into the dark. He moved like a ghost, his eyes darting for any sign of an opening, a loose plank, a gap in the wall, or even a hidden vent that might have been left behind by some long-gone occupant. The air smelled of mold and old wood, each breath a reminder of how far he had fallen into this place. James found himself at the north wall again, where the broken window lay. He crouched beside it, feeling for a crack that could widen enough to slip through. His fingers traced the splintered frame. The wood was weak, but not yet broken. He whispered to himself, just one more push, and he pushed with all his might. The window groaned, then gave way. A sliver of darkness opened, just wide enough for him to fit. The wind rushed in, carrying a chill that cut through his coat. He slipped through the narrow opening, heart pounding like a drumbeat in his chest. He emerged into the night, the sirens still wailing but now from a distance that seemed less threatening. He could hear them in the distance, but he was no longer trapped inside the cabin. He turned to look back at the rotting structure, its walls crumbling, its windows broken, its beams sagging like a dying tree. His breath came in ragged gasps as he ran deeper into the forest, the police's footsteps fading behind him. The isolation of the woods pressed against his shoulders. Each step carried him farther from civilization and closer to an unknown fate. The cabin remained, a decaying monument to his desperation and the moral rot that clung to his reputation. He paused for a moment, looking back at the broken window he had forced open. The wind howled through the sliver of glass, whispering in his ears like a warning. He could feel the weight of the police's pursuit on his shoulders, a relentless pressure that threatened to crush him if he didn't keep moving. The forest was thick and dark. Every rustle could be an officer's footstep, yet James pushed forward, driven by the need to survive, to find safety, to maybe find a chance at redemption. But as he ran deeper into the woods, he wondered what would happen when he finally stopped. Would he find sanctuary or another trap? The cabin, with its rotting walls and broken windows, had become a symbol of his own decay, a physical representation of how far he had fallen. It also became a test. If he could escape this ruin, perhaps he could escape the prison that was his past. As the sirens faded into the distance, James felt a glimmer of hope flicker in his chest, an ember that might one day burn bright enough to light his way out of darkness. But every step forward was also a step deeper into uncertainty. He didn't know if he would ever find help or if he would be caught again. What will happen when the forest finally gives up its secrets? Will James find someone who can offer him redemption, or will the isolation claim him entirely? The answer lies in the next breath he takes, the next step he makes. The night pressed in from every direction, a heavy blanket of darkness that seemed to swallow the forest whole. James's breath fogged in short, ragged bursts as he clutched the warped wooden handle of the cabin door, sweat slicking his forearms. The sirens were already a low, insistent hum behind him, police boots thudding on gravel, radios crackling with frantic updates. He had escaped through the broken window just moments before, but the thin pane of glass was nothing more than a fragile promise. It could shatter under pressure, and the police would find another way in. The cabin itself groaned, its frame sagging like an old man's back. Moss clung to every exposed plank, turning them into slick green tiles that threatened to give way with each step. James slipped inside, heart pounding against his ribs, eyes darting to every corner. He knew the structure was a labyrinth of decayed timber and broken beams. It offered no easy exit. He pressed himself against the wall behind a cracked window frame, listening for the echo of footsteps that might be coming from outside, or perhaps from deeper within the cabin's hollowed heart. The creak of wood, soft at first, then sharper, sent a chill down his spine. It was a sound that had no rhythm, no pattern. It was simply there, an unspoken threat. His fingers tightened around the rough edge of a splintering beam as he tried to calm himself. He could feel the weight of every decision pressing on him like the thick air of the forest outside. He knew that if he confronted whatever lay in the shadows now, the police would find him immediately. If he hid, he might have time, but the danger was still very real. James slid along the floorboards until he found a narrow passageway hidden behind a tattered curtain. The darkness there seemed to swallow his light, and he could hear the creak of the cabin settling, an old house that had seen better days. He pressed his back against the cold stone wall, his heart hammering in his ears as the sound grew louder. The creaking became more pronounced, like a heartbeat syncing with his own pulse. A low, guttural groan rolled through the air, and James froze. The sound seemed to come from somewhere beyond the walls. Perhaps the police had found their way into the structure, or perhaps something else was moving in the shadows. A single twig snapped underfoot as someone or something moved closer. James held his breath. Every nerve on his body screamed for action. He could have stepped out, grabbed a weapon, confronted whatever lurked behind that creak. But the thought of being caught by the police, of losing his freedom forever, overrode any impulse to act. Instead, he slipped deeper into the darkness, where the shadows were thick and impenetrable. The cabin's interior became a maze of twisted beams and decayed rafters, each one offering a new hiding place. James crouched behind a fallen beam that had once supported a roof, now sagging dangerously. He could feel his heart pounding in his ears. The sound of the police sirens faded into an indistinguishable murmur. The creak returned, this time louder, closer, as if it were coming from right behind him. The air grew colder, and James felt a presence in the darkness that was not human. He could see a faint outline moving against the dim light of his flashlight. Something tall, perhaps a shadow cast by a figure or an animal that had slipped into the cabin. He held his breath, listening to every crackle, every rustle of leaves outside, and the steady thrum of the police search. The threat loomed in the shadows, unseen but palpably present. James knew he was trapped between two forces: police pursuit outside and an unknown presence inside. He had no choice but to wait, to survive until daylight or until the danger passed. The tension thickened as the creak receded momentarily, only to return with a sharper, more urgent sound. The cabin seemed to hold its breath with him. James' mind raced through possibilities. Escape again, hide, fight, none of them seemed viable. He could not risk his freedom by confronting the unseen danger, but he also could not simply wait for an inevitable confrontation that might end in his capture or death. He felt a shiver run down his spine as the silence returned, broken only by the distant echo of police radios and the forest's own whispering wind. The cabin was alive with menace, each creak a reminder that danger lurked in every corner. James's eyes darted to the shadows, searching for any sign of movement. The weight of his decision pressed heavily upon him. He had fled into this decayed structure to escape a life he could no longer live. Yet here he was, trapped in a place that mirrored his own moral rot. An old, rotting cabin that threatened to expose everything he had buried deep within himself. He could not see the police outside, but their presence loomed large and inevitable. He could not see what waited in the shadows inside, but its threat was no less real. He held his breath, listening for the next creak, knowing that each one might bring him closer to either salvation or doom. The silence between them was a deadly pause, an unspoken question hanging in the air. Would James risk everything to save an innocent, or will he let the night claim him? What consequence will this choice bring? The cabin's floorboards groan under his weight, each creak a warning echoing through the darkened room. James's breath is a cloud in the stale air, mingling with the rot that clings to every splintered beam. He presses a hand against the cracked door, feeling the cold metal of the lock slide out from its groove with a reluctant click. The sirens wail beyond the trees, a distant drumbeat of pursuit. But inside the cabin he is alone, except for the faint metallic clatter that rattles through the walls like a heartbeat. He steps forward, heart hammering, and turns his head toward the source. A chain hangs in the corner, its links tangled around an unseen object, each rung whispering as it shifts with the wind that seeps through broken windows. James stops short, instinct sharp as a knife blade. The sound is unmistakable. There is something there, hidden within the decaying walls. He knows the risk. Every footstep could trigger the police's search radius. Every breath could be heard by an unseen watcher. Yet his mind races back to a memory of a life he left behind, a life where redemption was a word whispered in the dark, not a name on a wanted list. He presses deeper into the shadows, moving like a ghost, each footfall muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves that have settled inside. The chain's clatter grows louder as he approaches, a low, metallic sigh that seems to call his name from the depths of the cabin. James reaches out, fingers brushing the rough metal. The chain feels cold, slick with grime and something else, perhaps sweat or blood. He pulls on it gently, testing its resistance. It snaps back against his palm as if it were a living thing, then yields, revealing a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Inside, he finds a small wooden box, its lid warped by time. Inside that box is a single key, worn but still functional. James' eyes widen. This could be a way out, a lock on a door that leads to freedom. He considers his next move. The police are only moments away. The cabin is a maze of decay and danger, yet the chain's rattling grows louder again, as if urging him forward. He feels the weight of the key in his palm and the pull of something larger than himself, a moral tug that gnaws at his conscience. He remembers why he fled, to escape not just the law, but the shame that clung to his name like moss on a stone. But now, standing before an unseen presence bound by a chain, he feels the echo of another life, one that might be caught in the same web of desperation. James hesitates, breathing shallowly as the sirens grow closer. He knows one choice: flee, leave the key behind and continue to run until his lungs burn out or a cop finds him, or he could risk it all, step into the unknown corner of the cabin and attempt to free whatever, or whoever, lies bound by that chain. The key in his hand feels heavier with each heartbeat, as if the very act of holding it weighs on his soul. He takes one more step toward the corner, eyes fixed on the trembling metal. Behind him, the cabin's darkness swallows the sound of pursuit. But within its walls, a new kind of danger waits, a choice that could either lead to redemption or to capture. He closes his fingers around the key, feeling its cold steel against his skin, and lets himself be pulled into the shadowed heart of the old cabin. Will James risk the certainty of freedom for the uncertain promise of rescue? The night had swallowed the forest whole, turning every leaf into a dark silhouette against the dim glow of starlight. James pressed his back to the rotting wall of the cabin, listening for the distant echo that would mean the end was near. A crackle burst through the thick silence, static followed by a sharp, urgent voice on a police radio. The sound reverberated off the cracked beams, a low-frequency warning that rippled through the mossy floorboards. James's heart hammered in his ears as he strained to hear every syllable, every pause. "You got a sighting near the old quarry," hissed the officer. "They're coming fast." The words were brief, but the weight of them was immense. The forest seemed to close around him, each creak and rustle magnified by the fear that pulsed through his veins. He could feel the pulse of engines in the distance, a steady thud that grew louder with each heartbeat. James crouched behind a broken window frame, eyes narrowed on the dimly lit path beyond the cabin walls. The police patrol moved in an unpredictable pattern, shifting from one tree to another, their footsteps muffled by leaves and underbrush. Their flashlights swept like living shadows, searching for any sign of him. He knew that if he made a move now, it would be a gamble with his life. He had the key, the evidence of his redemption hidden in the cabin's secret compartment. Yet every step forward risked exposing him to the patrol's lethal gaze. "Stay hidden," James whispered into the cold air, the words barely audible over the wind. The cabin creaked as if it were listening back. The officers paused, their radios crackling again. "Negative, no sign of a suspect," one responded, but his voice trembled with unease. He shifted his flashlight beam, searching the darkness for something that could be him. James let his breath fall into a slow rhythm, matching it to the forest's own pulse. The cabin's rot seemed to echo his own decay, a reminder of the reputation he had built in the past, now threatened by this very moment. He observed their patrol pattern like an old, weary hunter watching a lone deer, knowing the path they would take, how they'd turn their heads, where they'd pause. He noted that the officers moved in a loose zigzag, a pattern designed to cover more ground but leaving gaps between them. The forest itself was a maze, and James was a silent ghost navigating it. When one officer turned a corner, his flashlight caught on the gnarled roots of an ancient oak. The beam flickered as he paused, an opportunity perhaps for James to slip past unnoticed. He held his breath, feeling the wind shift through the broken panes, hearing the faint hiss of rust and decay. The cabin itself seemed to breathe with him. James's mind raced. If he waited too long, the patrol would converge on his hiding spot, but if he moved now, he risked stepping into the line of fire. He weighed the consequences, The possibility of being caught, the chance of saving himself by freeing the captive bound in the cabin's hidden compartment, or perhaps even risking everything for a fleeting moment of redemption. The distant crackle of a police radio cut through the forest once more. "All units, be on the lookout," barked the commanding officer. The voice was clipped, cold, an echo of authority that made James's pulse thud against his ribs. He could feel the danger becoming tangible, not just in the rumbling engines outside, but in the very walls around him. Each heartbeat seemed louder than the last, a drumbeat marking the inevitable clash between survival and surrender. The cabin's old wood groaned, as if it were breathing out the tension that hung heavy in the air. James pressed his palm to the cracked stone wall, feeling the roughness beneath his fingers, a tactile reminder of the weight he carried. He could not run forever. The forest would eventually give way to the patrol's relentless pursuit. He whispered a single word into the night: redemption. It was not an answer but a promise, a quiet vow that he would not let the darkness swallow him whole. He listened as the officers' footsteps approached, each step measured and deliberate. The echo of their boots resonated through the underbrush, a relentless reminder that time was slipping away. The cabin's rotting beams creaked, an ominous symphony to accompany his trembling thoughts. James knew he had to act. Whether he chose to flee alone or risk everything for the captive bound within the walls would decide not only his fate, but also whether his past could be redeemed in the quiet isolation of this ancient forest. The night pressed on, and with each passing second the danger grew closer, echoing the title's threat louder than any shout from a cop's radio. The question now hung in the air: would James find redemption by confronting the unknown within the cabin, or would he be swallowed by the pursuit that lurked beyond its decaying walls? The cabin groaned under the weight of its own decay, every splintered plank a testament to forgotten years. James pressed his forehead against the cold, damp wall, listening for the faintest echo that might betray the police's approach. The air smelled of mold and old timber, but somewhere deeper in the forest, the distant wail of sirens cut through the silence like a knife. A sudden, almost imperceptible creak made his heart leap. He spun on his heel, eyes darting to the shadows that clung to the walls. The sound was not the wind. It was something heavier, deliberate, like footsteps shuffling across floorboards worn smooth by time. His breath caught in a tight throat. The cabin offered no visible exits, but for a broken window near the roof, already sealed with splintered boards. He had used that escape route earlier, prying open the frame to slip through when the police were still a mile away. Now, however, he realized that any noise could betray his position. He crouched low, fingers brushing against the rough wood of the chair bolted to the floor. The chair's iron chain rattled faintly, as if it had been moved by an unseen hand. A soft, shaky voice drifted from within the dimness. "Help, please." The words were barely audible over the rustling leaves outside. Violet's name slipped through the cracks of his mind like a fragile echo. Violet. He felt her pulse beat against the chain, a desperate rhythm that tugged at something in him he had long buried beneath years of anger and regret. James's fingers trembled as they brushed the cold metal of the chain. The cabin seemed to hold its breath with him, every splintered plank waiting for his decision. He could have fled again, slipping through the broken window into the night, leaving Violet behind in that decaying refuge. Or he could risk everything, his freedom, his survival, to reach her. The voice whispered again, this time more urgently, as if it were the last breath of a dying candle. "Violet." He swallowed hard. The choice hung over him like the thick fog that rolled through the forest at dawn. He knew that any noise might alert the police to his presence, yet the thought of Violet, her eyes wide with terror, her body bound and shaking, filled him with a sudden, fierce resolve. "I'll help," he whispered back, his voice barely audible. The words were not an offer, but a promise forged in desperation. He could feel the weight of that vow settle against his ribs, tightening like a vice. The cabin seemed to shudder as if it answered. A faint creak reverberated through the floorboards, almost as if a new sound had joined the chorus of rustling timber and distant sirens. James stepped closer, careful not to disturb the chain or the chair's position. He reached out, fingers grazing the cold metal with the gentlest touch. Violet's eyes flickered open. The relief that washed over her face was almost too bright for the dim interior. She clutched at the chain with shaking hands, but she did not scream. Instead, she whispered a name, a plea wrapped in fear and hope. "James," she breathed, as if naming him would tether his resolve to her own fragile existence. He nodded, keeping his face hidden by the shadow of the broken window. He slid a small piece of cloth, an old rag from his pack, over the chain's lock. The motion was slow, deliberate, each movement measured against the ticking of an unseen clock that counted down to the police's arrival. The cabin seemed to breathe around them as the wind outside picked up, its howling echoing through the broken panes. James felt a sudden surge of cold sweat on his forehead, but he kept his breathing steady, focusing on the soft rustle of the rag against metal. Violet shivered, her shoulders trembling as if she were in the grip of an invisible hand. The sound of distant footsteps grew louder, a low rumble that made James's stomach drop into his gut. He could hear the thud of boots on dirt, the clatter of a police radio in a nearby vehicle. The realization hit him with brutal clarity. Every second he spent helping Violet was a second he was exposing himself to the threat outside. Yet the bond forming between them, an unspoken pact forged in that decaying cabin, was something James could not ignore. It felt like a flicker of light in a cavernous darkness, an ember that might either burn him alive or keep him warm. He leaned closer, whispering into her ear with a voice as hushed as the wind outside. "Hold on," he said softly. "I have a way out." The words were not just reassurance, they were a promise of a shared escape, a fragile thread connecting their fates. As he spoke, James felt his heart thudding against his ribs like a drum in a war zone. The cabin seemed to pulse with the rhythm of their breaths, each inhale and exhale an echo of the looming danger outside. The distant sirens cut through the air again, a sharp, metallic cry that sounded almost ceremonial, a herald for the inevitable confrontation. James could feel his mind racing as he weighed the cost of his promise against the certainty of the police's approach. In that moment, under the rotting beams and the watchful eyes of the forest, James made a silent vow to himself. He would not let Violet become another victim of the world's indifference. He would risk everything to keep her alive, even if it meant surrendering his own freedom. The wind howled louder, rattling the broken windows as if trying to pry open the cabin's secrets. The police footsteps grew closer still, a relentless march that seemed to echo through the very bones of the old structure. James tightened his grip on the rag, feeling its frayed edges against his skin. He could hear Violet's heart beating in sync with his own, a frantic rhythm that matched the pulse of his own conscience. In the dim light of the cabin, he realized that his redemption would be measured not by how far he ran, but by how much he chose to hold onto another's life. The story hung in balance, a fragile thread between survival and sacrifice. The cabin's decay mirrored the rot within James's past, yet it also offered him an unexpected chance for renewal, if only he could keep his promise. Will this small promise of help pull them both towards salvation, or will it doom them to a tragic end? James's heart hammered like a drum in the silence of the cabin, each beat echoing off warped beams and splintered floorboards. The wind howled outside, rattling the broken windows, as if trying to pry open the darkened door that had swallowed him. He crouched behind a sagging trunk, his breath shallow, eyes narrowed on the narrow gap between the back wall and the moss-laden earth. Footsteps thudded close, heavy boots crunching through leaves, a rhythm that grew louder with each passing second. The police were near. He could hear them now. The low growl of a patrol car's engine, the metallic clink of a radio as officers called out names in hushed tones. He had been chasing himself for weeks. This was the moment when his past and present collided like two converging rivers. Violet lay on a chair that had once been a throne of comfort, now a twisted relic bound by rusted chains. Her skin was pale against the rough wood, her eyes wide with terror. The faint clatter of metal rang in the still air, chains rattling as she struggled. She did not see him yet. He could hear her sobbing, a fragile plea that cut through the tension like a knife. James moved with the caution of a man who had already lost too much. He slid past the chair, keeping his body low to avoid any sound that might betray his presence. The floor creaked beneath his feet, but he was quick, just enough to keep his breath from breaking. He pressed his back against the wall, feeling the coldness seep into his bones. The footsteps approached again, closer this time. A boot landed on a splintered plank, sending a shockwave of sound through the cabin's skeleton. James held his breath. The air seemed thicker, as if the very walls were holding their own breath in anticipation. The police, oblivious to the danger within, continued their search, unaware that they were walking straight into a trap. He could see them now, two silhouettes framed by the dim light filtering through broken panes. They stood at the back door, shoulders hunched, radios crackling with commands that sounded like distant thunder. Their presence was a threat, but it also offered James an opportunity to shield Violet from the same fate he had narrowly escaped. James lunged forward, heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his ears. He grabbed a fallen log, a jagged piece of timber that lay where a wall once stood, and hurled it toward the back door. The log crashed against the frame with a metallic clang, splintering the wood and sending splinters skittering across the floor. The police halted, startled by the sudden noise. Their heads snapped in his direction, eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Violet's gaze flicked to him, confusion and fear mingling on her face. James didn't answer. He simply stood between the log and the door, his back pressed against the warped timber. The police hesitated, their breathing shallow as they weighed their options. One officer whispered something, perhaps a command to move forward or retreat. The air was thick with the smell of decay and sweat. James felt the weight of the log in his hands, its rough surface pressing into his palm. He had no choice. If he didn't block the entrance, Violet would be caught, and so would he. The risk was clear. If the police saw him, they would shoot. If they didn't see him, he would still be trapped inside. He held the log steady as the officers approached, their footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves outside. A breathless pause stretched between them, a moment suspended in time, where the cabin seemed to hold its breath. The police raised their hands, guns aimed at the back door, ready to fire if they sensed danger. James's eyes flicked to Violet again. She was trembling, her fingers clutching at the chains that bound her wrists. He could see the desperation in her eyes, an unspoken plea for help, a silent request for salvation. In that instant, his own survival became secondary to the safety of another human being. The officer's voice crackled over the radio. "We've got a suspect, moving fast. Keep the perimeter tight." The words cut through the silence like a knife. James knew the officers would not hesitate if they felt threatened. He could feel the heat of their eyes on him, the silent judgment passing between them. He tightened his grip on the log, feeling its weight shift in his hands. The wood was cold and damp, but he pressed it against the door until it fit snugly into the crack. With a grunt, he shifted it further, blocking any line of sight or passage. The log splinters dug into the wooden frame, creating a makeshift barricade that would give Violet a chance to escape. The police officers exchanged glances, then stepped back. Their breathing became more controlled as they realized the obstacle before them. One officer whispered a command, "Hold position." The others nodded, their weapons still aimed at the door, ready for any sudden movement. James let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He could feel his pulse racing against his ribs, adrenaline flooding through him like an electric current. In that moment of stillness, the cabin seemed to breathe with him, its walls creaking in sympathy, its rotting timber exhaling old stories of betrayal and survival. Violet's eyes flicked around the cabin once more, searching for a way out. She saw James standing between her and the police, a lone figure who had made an impossible choice. The weight of his decision hung in the air, thick as the scent of decay that clung to every surface. The silence was broken only by the distant echo of the forest, leaves rustling, branches creaking, a faint whisper of wind through the old trees. James felt the world narrow down to this single point: the log, the door, Violet's trembling form, and the looming threat of the police beyond. He knew that any misstep would expose him, endanger both his life and hers, yet he also understood that staying hidden would mean watching Violet be taken, an act that would haunt him forever. His choice had been made. Now the consequences would unfold like a storm gathering on the horizon. The officers' footsteps receded as they adjusted their positions, leaving James alone with the log and Violet. The cabin seemed to hold its breath once more, as if waiting for the next wave of danger or salvation. In the dim glow of the broken windows, James felt the weight of his decision settle upon him like a stone in his chest. He could feel every heartbeat echoing through the cracked walls, each pulse a reminder that he had chosen to stand between the darkness and a fragile life. Would this act of protection bring them both safety, or would it be the final crack that shattered their chances? The cabin's silence whispered its answer, but only time would reveal whether James's sacrifice would carve a path for redemption or lead to an inevitable downfall. The cabin groaned as the police car slammed its doors against the sagging frame, splinters flaring like broken teeth. The engine roared, a low growl that vibrated through the floorboards, rattling loose nails in a frantic dance. James stared at the front of the dilapidated building, his breath a ragged cloud in the stale air. "Open up!" barked a voice from the driver's seat, metal clanging against the frame as the officer pulled the hood forward. The siren wail pierced the forest's hush, a warning that the world outside was closing in like a fist around a trembling hand. James felt the old wood beneath his feet shift, as if the cabin itself were exhaling its last breath. He had taken refuge in this place because it offered him a chance to slip away from the relentless pursuit of the police. Now, with the front door threatened by the weight of that vehicle, he knew the moment for redemption was upon him. The sound of the police radio crackled through the thin walls. A distant shout cut across the silence. "We've got a suspect in this cabin! Lock it down!" The words were a promise of imminent confrontation. Violet's eyes darted from James to the approaching car. Her fingers clutched at the chain that bound her chair. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Please, don't let them find me." James's throat tightened. He could hear the metal of the lock on his own chest, the cold weight of his past pressing against him like a shackle. Yet in the dim light he saw Violet's fear reflected back at him, an echo of his own desperation. "Hold tight," he said, voice barely louder than the wind that seeped through broken windows. "I'll keep them away." The front door was jammed by the car's weight, but the back door lay open, a narrow slit in the decaying structure that offered a sliver of hope. The police officer's footsteps approached, each footfall echoing like thunder. James could feel the heat of their rifles as they pressed against the cabin walls. He slipped through the gap at the back, his heart hammering against his ribs. The night was dark, but the faint glow of moonlight filtered through broken panes, painting the floor with silver stripes. He moved silently, every step measured, each footfall a potential death knell for Violet if discovered. The police officer burst into the cabin's front, gun drawn, eyes scanning the dim interior. His voice was sharp. "You're under arrest." The words rang like a bell in the stale air. James froze mid-step, his body poised between survival and sacrifice. A sudden shudder rattled the cabin as a loose beam swayed under the impact of the car's weight. The police officer's gun retracted in reflex, leaving a brief window. James seized it, lunging forward with a burst of adrenaline that seemed to eclipse the fear that had gripped him moments before. He collided with the officer, knocking the rifle aside. The officer stumbled, eyes widening as he realized the man in front of him was not a fugitive but a guardian. "Who are you?" the officer demanded, hand trembling on the trigger. James's voice steadied, resolute. "I'm the one who keeps this place from becoming a crime scene." The officer's gaze flickered to Violet's chair, where she trembled in her restraints. The realization struck him like a blow. He was confronting not only a fugitive, but an ally of justice. "Get out!" the officer barked, gun still drawn. "You're surrounded!" James stepped forward, his silhouette casting a long shadow across the rotting floorboards. He felt the weight of the cabin's decay against his back, each splinter and rusting nail a reminder that he was trapped within his own past. "Stay behind me," James whispered to Violet. Her eyes met his, filled with trust and terror in equal measure. The officer's hand tightened on the trigger. The sound of gunfire echoed through the forest as bullets ricocheted off the wooden beams, splintering the cabin further. The impact sent a shockwave that rattled every plank, every chain, every breath within the walls. James pressed himself against the back wall, his shoulders bearing the weight of both Violet's safety and his own survival. He felt the heat of gunfire licking at his cheekbones, the cold metal of the officer's rifle pressed to his ear as he listened for any sign of pursuit beyond the cabin. The police car's engine roared louder, a looming threat that grew closer with each passing second. The cabin seemed to shrink around him, its walls breathing in rhythm with the pounding heartbeats of those trapped within. "Don't let them find you," Violet whispered again, her voice barely audible over the gunfire and the forest's chorus of distant sirens. James clenched his jaw, feeling the chain that bound him to a life he had once vowed to escape. Yet in that moment, the chain became a tether to something greater, an act of redemption forged in the crucible of survival. The officer's rifle was now aimed at James, the barrel pointing toward Violet's trembling form. The sound of his own breath filled the space as he steadied himself for the inevitable shot. "Hold on," James said softly, but with unwavering conviction. "I'll keep them away." In the dim glow of moonlight, the cabin's walls seemed to pulse, each creak a testament to the desperate struggle unfolding within. The police car's doors rattled against the frame, as if the world itself were trying to break through. The officer raised his rifle, and in that instant, James made a choice that would define him forever. He stepped forward, blocking the path between the officer and Violet, a living shield amid a storm of violence. The gunshot rang out, a single devastating crack that shattered the fragile silence. The bullet struck the cabin's warped frame, sending splinters flying like shards of broken promises. James felt the impact reverberate through his bones, the shockwave rattling his very soul. Violet screamed as the officer's gun fired again, her body slamming against the chair with a force that sent the chain clattering to the floor. The sound was a cacophony of pain and fear, echoing through the decaying structure. James pressed himself forward, his shoulders collapsing under the weight of his own life and Violet's safety. He felt the cold metal of the officer's rifle press against his back as if it were an iron grip on his future. The cabin trembled, its walls groaning under the relentless assault of gunfire. The police car roared past, its engine screaming like a wounded animal. In that moment, James understood that safety had shattered. His freedom was gone, and the only path left was a single choice: to protect Violet at all costs. He looked up at the officer, eyes burning with resolve. "You can't kill me," he said, voice steady despite the blood pooling in his ears. "I'm not your target." The officer's gaze flicked from James to Violet, a momentary hesitation that seemed like a sliver of mercy. But the police radio crackled again, and the officer raised his rifle once more. James closed his eyes, feeling the heat of the gunfire wash over him as he took one last breath. The cabin's walls creaked and groaned around him, the sound of decay echoing louder than ever before. In that instant, the world narrowed to a single point: the choice between redemption and survival, between freedom and sacrifice. He had chosen to protect Violet at the cost of his own life, and in doing so, He left behind a fragile hope for her future. The cabin's rotting beams shuddered, the final crack echoing through the forest as James made his last stand. The police car's headlights flickered across the broken windows, painting a picture of a man who had given everything to save another. The forest whispered around him, trees bending in the wind, leaves rustling with the memory of gunfire and sorrow. In that moment, the cabin became a symbol of both decay and redemption, its walls bearing witness to the final act of a man who chose connection over escape. As the last echoes faded into silence, one question lingered in the air. What does it truly mean to escape when your freedom is measured not by distance, but by the weight of someone else's safety? The forest held its breath as the police car sputtered to a halt before the cabin's broken front. Dust hung in the air like ghostly motes, and from the cracked windows the only light was the orange glow of flashlights slicing through darkness. James stood in the doorway, his back pressed against splintered wood, fists clenched around a rusted shotgun that had once belonged to a soldier, not a fugitive. The cold wind whipped at his face, but he felt nothing like the chill that settled over Violet's trembling body inside. Her eyes were wide with fear, but her lips trembled with a new resolve. "Move!" she whispered, voice barely audible over the crackle of the radio in the officer's ear. James lifted a hand, palm up. "Wait!" His voice was low, but carried an unsteady strength that made Violet look up at him with hope. The officers outside, two men with hard eyes and guns pointed straight ahead, were closing in. Their footsteps thudded on the gravel, each step a drumbeat of imminent danger. The first officer's hand slipped to his sidearm as he raised it, but James was already moving. He stepped forward, shoulders hunched, his silhouette merging with the shadows cast by the broken beams. The door creaked beneath his weight, a splintered plank threatened to give way. Yet he did not flinch. He pressed himself into the doorway and braced against the frame. The second officer, his hand now gripping a shotgun, took a step toward the cabin, eyes darting between the darkness inside and James's figure. "Freeze!" he shouted, voice echoing off the walls. The words cut through the silence like knives. James turned slowly, his gaze locked on the officer. He raised the shotgun in one hand, its barrel pointing at the man. The metal glinted faintly under the flashlight beam. He held his breath as the officer's eyes narrowed, a silent challenge passing between them. The officer's hand trembled. "You're not going to get away with this," he said, voice strained. "We'll take you in." James didn't respond. Instead, he let the shotgun click, the sound sharp and deliberate. The officer flinched, but then steadied himself, ready to fire. "Do you want me to?" James began, his voice steady, yet the words were cut off by a sudden crack of wood behind him. The cabin's floorboards groaned as something heavy moved inside, Violet perhaps, or maybe the police pushing through the back door. The officer fired. The shot rang out, a metallic shriek that ricocheted off the walls. James felt the recoil in his chest, but he kept his composure. He stepped forward again, blocking the path of the second officer's gun with his body. His own shotgun was now at his shoulder, ready to fire if needed. The officer's eyes flickered from James to Violet, then back to the man who had become a shield. "You're going to die for this," he hissed. But there was a tremor in his voice, fear of being caught, fear of losing control. James didn't flinch. He felt the weight of every decision that had led him here, the escape from the prison, the broken cabin, the chain that bound Violet. The chains of his past, now replaced by the chains he was about to break for her. "Run!" James whispered into Violet's ear, breath hot against her skin. "Get out!" Violet's eyes widened as she heard the words. She tried to free herself, but the rope around her wrists tightened with each frantic pull. Her hands were slick with sweat, her heart hammered against her ribs like a drum in war. James seized the moment. He lunged at the officer, his shotgun clashing with the man's gun. The two weapons collided, sparks flying. The officer stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder where James had struck him. His eyes flickered between pain and anger. "Move!" James shouted, shoving the officer away from Violet. "Now!" The second officer, his weapon now in disarray, faced James head-on. He fired again, but this time James was ready. He lowered his shotgun to his shoulder, aiming at the officer's chest. The first shot rang out, a single bullet that lodged into the officer's torso, sending him crashing against the cabin's wall. The police car rattled as the sirens wailed louder. The officers inside were now panicked, their weapons trembling in their hands. One of them shouted, "We're surrounded! Get him!" James did not pause. He stood between Violet and the men who had chased him for years. His body was a barrier, his breath steady, his eyes fixed on the front door where the police car's lights glowed like a death sentence. "Stay!" he yelled to Violet, but she already sprinted toward the back of the cabin, her feet pounding against the rotting floorboards. The chain around her wrists clanged as she tore through it with desperate force. She burst into the forest, disappearing among the trees, the night swallowing her small figure. The police shouted orders. The officers raised their weapons again. James held his ground, knowing that each moment was a chance for Violet to escape. He felt the weight of every choice he had made, the cost of redemption burning in his chest like an ember. A gunshot echoed from behind him, sharp and final. The officer who had been shot earlier staggered forward, his weapon slipping from his grasp. James watched as the man's body fell, a dark silhouette against the forest's gloom. The sound of another gunshot rang out, a warning that there were still more bullets in the air. The police car slammed into the front of the cabin, its door slamming shut with a deafening thud. The impact rattled the beams. A splintered piece of wood shattered, falling onto James's back. He felt the pain shoot through his spine, but he did not waver. His gaze was fixed on the horizon where Violet had vanished. "Sir," one officer barked, "you're under arrest." James stared at him, eyes reflecting the flashlight's harsh glare. He could feel the weight of the world closing in. Police tape, sirens, the rustling leaves that seemed to whisper his name. Yet he held on to a single truth. By standing there, he had given Violet a chance to live. He raised his shotgun again, pointing it at the police car's door. The barrel gleamed under the flashlight beam. He pulled the trigger, and the gunshot rang out, a sound that echoed through the trees like an oath. The police car shuddered, the front door cracked open, and a gust of wind blew across the cabin, carrying with it the scent of decay and possibility. James felt his body sway, the world spinning. He could see Violet's silhouette in the distance, fading into the night. His heart thudded against his ribs as he realized that every breath would be his last. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of redemption settle upon him like a cloak. The forest around him seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the final act of this desperate man who had chosen to sacrifice everything for one small chance at salvation. Will James's sacrifice truly free Violet, or will it only cement his own legacy as a man undone by guilt? The cabin groaned like a dying beast as the last shards of daylight slipped behind the twisted pines. Inside, James felt the walls close in, each splintered beam a silent judge of his fate. Outside, sirens wailed, an iron chorus that drummed against the cracked roof and rattled the chains still clinging to Violet's wrists. A sudden tremor shook the floorboards. The sound was not of wind, but of something heavy moving just beyond the broken window he'd forced open. James froze, his breath a jagged whisper in the stale air. He could hear footsteps, soft, deliberate, like someone pacing a narrow hallway. The police were close enough that their breathing seemed to seep through the wood. Violet's eyes flickered over the scarred wooden chair she was bound to. Her fingers clutched the rope with shaking desperation. "James," she hissed, voice barely audible over the echoing crackle of the cabin's collapse. "Please, help me." He stepped from the shadow of a sagging beam, each movement calculated. The cabin's roof had begun to buckle under the weight of its own decay, and beams threatened to fall with every breath he took. He lifted his hand to Violet, not to free her, but to steady him both physically and mentally. "Hold on," he whispered, voice roughened by adrenaline. "I'll keep you safe." The police burst through the front door in a hail of gunfire that splintered the old wooden planks. Bullets punched holes where the beams had already weakened. James stood between them and Violet, his body a shield, as shards of plaster and splintered wood fell like rain. "Don't move!" he shouted. But the officer's eyes were on him, not on Violet. Their guns rattled in their holsters, their faces twisted with a blend of fury and determination. The cabin seemed to shudder around them. The old nails that once held it together now screamed under pressure. In the dim light, James saw the mechanism, a rusted lever hidden beneath a loose floorboard. It was the last hope he had left, a way to destroy everything in one explosive breath. He understood what would happen. The cabin would collapse entirely, taking the police with it, leaving Violet free but trapped in his dying act. He pressed the lever. A dull thud reverberated through the wood as a chain of explosives ignited. The room swelled with heat and light. The air tasted of burning timber and metal. James felt the first tremor beneath his feet, a shudder that would soon become an earthquake. Violet's eyes widened, panic flashing across her face like lightning. "James!" she cried, but her voice was swallowed by the roar as the cabin's structure began to buckle. A massive beam groaned, then snapped, sending a spray of splinters into the air. The roof sagged, a dark curtain of timber falling in slow motion. He held onto Violet's hand with a strength that belied his shaking limbs. "Run!" he barked over the chaos. "Get out before it's too late." She struggled against her restraints, but the rope was tight. Every inch she could pull would be a step closer to death if the cabin fell on her. James tightened his grip, fighting back the urge to let go as the walls around them cracked and splintered. The explosion roared, a thunderclap that sent a shockwave through the forest. The wooden structure shuddered like a beast in agony. A massive chunk of roof collapsed onto the floor, crushing the doorway between James and Violet. Bullets ricocheted off the debris, their paths twisted by the crumbling walls. James felt the heat surge up his spine. Sparks leapt from the exploding mechanism, licking at his clothes. He knew the final seconds were slipping away. His body was a vessel of fire now, but he could still move, his mind burning with one last thought. She must live. Ooh. He shoved Violet forward, using every ounce of his remaining strength to push her toward the broken window. The air rushed in, a cold wind that carried the scent of pine and danger. With a final burst of force, he threw her through the gap, the splintered frame shattering under her weight. Violet stumbled onto the forest floor, her chest heaving as she gasped for breath. She looked back once, seeing James, his eyes darkened by smoke, his body collapsing to the ground in a heap of wood and flame. The cabin was now a ruin, a silent testament to his sacrifice. The last thing he saw before the world dissolved into darkness was Violet's face, pale with fear but alive. He heard her whisper, barely audible over the roar, "Thank you. I'm sorry." And then everything went black. Will James's final act leave a lasting echo of redemption for Violet? Or will his sacrifice be swallowed by the very walls he chose to collapse?